Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Bite podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath. And today we're going to be talking about the historical Jesus and the Gospel of John. Can the Gospel of John be utilized in any reliable way to reconstruct the historical Jesus? And to that end, I have the link to Jim's book, John's Apologetic Christology, Legitimation, Development, and Johannine Christology. The link to purchase that book will be in the description below and the pinned comment. That being said, Jim, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Can you tell us about the Gospel of John in the sense of trying to reconstruct, I forgive the phone ringing, reconstruct the historical Jesus using the Gospel of John?
Sure, yeah. Where to start? The consensus view for many a year, many a decade, has been that the Gospel of John is less useful when it comes to historical Jesus. And the simple reason for that is that John's Christology seems to be more developed. And so the assumption is that it takes more time to get there and to that viewpoint. And so it's later and therefore further removed, both in conceptuality, but also in distance and time from the actual events. And then also the fact that we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, which have so much in common. And so it's been treated as a case of 3 against 1. And those two factors really are the key ones in historians having largely assumed and taken as a premise that the Gospel of John is less useful when it comes to the figure of the historical Jesus.
So do you think that the Gospel of John contains information about the historical Jesus that's probably true, that's not found in the Synoptics?
Yes, and that last little phrase, I'm glad you added it because it adds a distinctive element to it. But because there are some places where the Gospel of John may simply have a different perspective or different timing on an event that is also found in the other Gospels. Classic example being the action of Jesus in the temple, right, driving out the money changers and the animals. And so there, John has a different timing, also adds in some details like that Jesus made a rope of cords and so on. And so there are differences of that sort, but I think also in other areas, right? The Gospel of John is the only one that depicts John the Baptist and Jesus being active at the same time. And what everyone thinks of the historicity of John the Baptist directing everyone towards Jesus and directing attention away from himself, the assumption there is that there's this time when Jesus and John are connected before John is imprisoned. And the possibility that something like that could be historical, right, is really, really worth considering. And some historians, despite the premise, despite the assumptions, have drawn precisely that conclusion.
Do you think that John knew the Synoptic Gospels, or is it independent of them?
Okay. Well, Mark Goodacre's book that may be the decisive one in answering that question is just out. So I've gone back and forth on this, and I'm not firmly committed one way or the other. There's been a strong enough case that could be made, in my opinion, for John being possibly being independent, that I have not, in my past scholarship, assumed dependence. I've always tried to leave the options open so that I'm not excluding, not making my conclusions seem less plausible to somebody who has different assumptions on this than I do. What I would say is that I think that it's important not to overemphasize dependence versus independence as though these are a strict dichotomy, right? So Matthew and Luke both use Mark, and Matthew and Luke share material in common. And so either Luke knew Matthew, Matthew knew Luke, or they both use a common source, right? The Q hypothesis. In any and all of those scenarios, it would be wrong to assume that dependence on another written text means no independent knowledge of the stories and traditions that are in that text. And so it's entirely possible, for instance, that Luke has additional material that's not in Mark, let's say, and not in Q or in Matthew, but also that Luke had already heard things that are included in Mark before reading that text. And so, in turn, it's possible that what Luke heard represented an earlier form of the tradition, something that was more authentic, right? That Mark deliberately tried to give a different impression than what was most widely circulating. And so if Luke then reverts that back, then what we're dealing with is not so much Lucan redaction of Mark as Lucan retroversion of the Markan story to an earlier form, right? And so I think we need to keep that possibility in mind when studying the relationships between any of the Gospels. And that's why even if John is dependent on the other Gospels, I think there's good reason to conclude that John has other traditions that John is aware of, right? That this Gospel knows material independently, right, of those sources, even if the author was aware of them, and regardless of whether the author was aware of them for a long time or became aware of them late in the process of writing or some other scenario. So I would say that even if John's Gospel reflects awareness of the other Gospels, that doesn't exclude the possibility that the Gospel of John includes independent material.
And what kind of methodology do you follow to determine when the Gospel of John is reflecting probably reliable history about the historical Jesus and when it is not?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right? Historical Jesus studies has been famous or notorious, depending on your viewpoint, for trying to articulate some very, very clear and strict rules for recognizing authentic material and then debating them. Often in historical study, it really is just a question of how many sources we have, how early, whether they seem to be actually concerned with conveying historical events, and then you're asking the same kinds of questions that one asks in a courtroom or in any sort of evaluation of evidence. If there's no reason to discount the historicity of this due to some other obvious consideration, then how do we judge the probability, right? And among the things that we consider is this something that the author might make up because it served their interests? And so we could pay close attention to the work as a piece of literature to determine what is it trying to say. And then if there's something in there that seems too good to be true and there's nobody else that confirms it, we'll be suspicious and think maybe this is invented. If there's something in there that seems to be awkward, right, so that the author actually seems to be doing some damage control in relation to it, then we might think, not necessarily automatically jump to this is historical, but we'll say is this author is probably not inventing this. Right? That doesn't automatically get us back to historicity, but what it does do is take us back and allow us to use this text that we have to have access to earlier tradition, what was circulating in that time. And once we've done that, that's getting us at least one step closer to the historical figure. And so it really is just a question of applying the principles of historical study. And I'd say that it seems to me that because so many people in the field of historical Jesus research have gotten there by way of a faith tradition, often a faith tradition that assure them that the Gospels are perhaps inerrant or infallible or something like that. I have a feeling that in this field we tend to be more skeptical of the sources, less willing to consider, this might be historical than would be the case if you had some secular Greco-Roman historians or historians of Jewish history looking at these texts as part of their own field without all the controversy and the debate and the vested interest that Jesus brings with him.
What kind of sources do you think the author of John's Gospel had access to? Maybe oral sources or lost texts besides the ones that we have, or both?
Yes, and it's hard to know. There are some things that seem to indicate a literary process, and so the two main options that have been explored, and there are whole scholarly works as well as commentaries that reflect each of these, and so anybody who's interested can dig into them. But there are things that seem like seams, right? Literary seams in the text, right? Places where it seems like some new material has been inserted. The chapter 6, roughly speaking, approximately chapter 6 of the Gospel of John seems to come between some material that, if it were not separated, if it were not on opposite sides of chapter 6, would flow more naturally, and you would see the natural connection, right? They still seem in chapter 7 to be talking about things that were raised in chapter 5. And so there are places where it seems like either we have source material that has then been supplemented, or it could be that, before being widely published, this work went through more than one edition. And so that's an example. There are things like the numbering of signs, which doesn't persist for very long, but seems to reflect the possibility that there was what scholars have called a signs source, right? One that went through numbering of signs and counted them. And it's interesting that at the very end of the gospel, we have a mention of a third sign, although it's third in relation to something else. But there too, scholars have thought maybe this is moved to the end and therefore is reworded somewhat. So the challenge is that apart from the Synoptic Gospels, we don't have other sources that could be source of John's Gospel. One exception being, right, there is one of the papyri we have that has a clear connection with the debates in John, and so whether it is a later work, which is what we tend to assume, right, because we have so little of it that it would be difficult to make a strong case that it's source material used by the author of the Gospel of John, but it is possible, right? So all that to say that there are some indications that there has been use of sources and or redaction of sources, but it's much harder to get from there to any kind of like detailed reconstruction of what they might have been.
And how many editions of John's Gospel do you think it'd go through?
So I would say that there's at least a first and second edition. Now I want to add that again, this is not like modern times where a book has to sell widely and sell a lot of copies before it goes into a second edition. So that's not what I'm envisaging here, but it does seem as though, as I said, chapter 6, there seems to be some interruption. There's also, the addition of the story of the woman accused of adultery in John chapter 8. And so if the addition of that represents, yet another edition, then that would be a third one. But it does seem to me that, chapter 6 is added at some point. It does seem to me that some of the material, at the very least, may have had a different organization. There are things in the final discourse of Jesus as well that seem like there may have been some supplementing there. And the prologue, the question whether the prologue represents an original part of the gospel or whether it was added at a later stage. So I'm not absolutely certain about any of them, but the fact that there are so many places where it seems like there has been some editing and some insertion of material where it would make good sense without it. May, in some cases, may have a better flow if that was not in between. Right? We can't say that about the prologue because it's not in between anything. So, yeah, I'd say 2 or 3. Would be my guess. But there are scholars who would say both fewer than that, but also who would say significantly more.
How is John's Christology different from the Synoptics?
Yeah, so there's a place that was the focus of my doctoral research, and it's remained something of interest ever since. I'm one of those scholars that I was alluding to earlier who passed through a context of sort of conservative faith, the sort of religious formation that led me to assume that if these 4 Gospels are in the New Testament, then they should all more or less be saying the same thing. And then I took an undergraduate course on the Gospel of John, and just reading it that closely, there was no way to deny that it's really different. We can identify this statistically, right? Jesus speaks in the first person, right? Uses I much more frequently than in the other Gospels. Speaks about the Father in a way that is very infrequent in the other Gospels. And so its depiction of Jesus, of his relationship to God, there's so much that's different. And then we have, in the beginning was the Word, right? No other Gospel has that. What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before, right? The descent and ascent of the Son of Man is not in the other Gospels. The pre-existence is not in the other Gospels. And so once it became clear to me that the Gospel of John really is different, its depiction of Jesus, its Christology is different, then I was just eager to figure out why that was the case. And in my view, the conclusion I drew was to find a sociological method that seemed to fit the evidence and be applicable to this case. And so I drew on Peter Berger and Thomas Lippmann's work in the sociology of knowledge on what's known as legitimation. And that's the study of how the effort to defend beliefs that we hold also causes our beliefs and our ideology and our worldview to develop in the process. And that seems to me to explain persuasively how it can be the case and why it's the case that the Gospel of John seems so closely related to earlier material and earlier depictions of Jesus in Christian literature, and yet have these distinctive developments. And so debates such as we get in John 9 about what Jesus could reveal that Moses didn't, right? The objection is placed on the lips of the Jewish authorities. We know God spoke to Moses. This man, we don't know where he comes from, right? What can, Jesus, Moses went up the mountain. What more do you need? And so in response to that, right, there being the idea of a figure, the Son of Man, who pre-exists in heaven, right? The one like a Son of Man from Daniel 7, further interpreted in books like the Similitudes of Enoch. This human figure, who's identified by that point at least as the Messiah. Well, if that figure pre-existed, right, nobody's drawing very literal conclusions from that. This is a vision that's mostly about the future, but this figure seems to be prepared in heaven. If he's there in heaven, prepared for the moment when he's to appear on earth in history, then he might actually be able to tell you things that no one else would know about heavenly things, right? And so drawing on that and drawing new conclusions based on that premise and that those assumptions are already there in the tradition in order to address issues. How can Christians claim that Jesus has been exalted to God's right hand, even bears the name of God, and so identifying him as the becoming flesh of this divine attribute, right, that was there in the beginning, helps to justify that, right? And so I think that on the one hand, John has developed things in very important ways. On the other hand, there's a tendency to read John as much further along the route to the Council of Nicaea than I think it is. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is still a man who told others what he saw from God and heard from God, and still refers in prayer to the Father as the only true God. And so the perspective of this author is that most likely at his baptism, the Word became flesh. The Word became united with this human life so that he could exercise divine power and authority. And so when he's exalted, it's a return of that Word to the place where the Word had been eternally. And that's, on the one hand, very closely related to the other Gospels' depiction of the Spirit of God descending, and entering Jesus, right? And so that one's having this encounter with the power and presence of God in and through encountering Jesus. And on the other hand, the exaltation of Jesus, such as we get in like Philippians 2. And so you put those pieces together and draw out some further implications for them, and you can get something like what we get in John. And so John is definitely carrying things further, but not as much. He's not as far along the road to the Council of Nicaea as some readers tend to, and I'd say many readers tend to assume.
What do you think the purpose of composing the Gospel of John was? Why is it so different from the Synoptics?
Yeah, well, this is one of those works where we're lucky enough to have the author's statement as to why these things were written. And, authors often have more in mind than what they explicitly say. But the author says towards the end, right, that there are many other things that could be written. These things were written that you may believe or go on believing, right? So it's less clear whether it's aimed at persuading others or convincing those within to remain true to their faith. And those are related aims, and so it's not a very significant distinction. But we actually have different manuscripts with different forms of the verb there, and so there's some ambiguity. But at any rate, that you may believe or continue believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing may have life in His name. Right. So the author has a religious aim, believes that faith in Jesus, trust in Jesus, goes hand in hand with experiencing eternal life. And on the other hand, whether it's to persuade the unpersuaded or to persuade those who are persuaded to remain persuaded, whether it's mostly apologetics, as we might say, or legitimation, right, aimed at those inside, either way, the assumption at work in apologetics and in legitimation is that there are objections that one might have or one might raise to belief. And so the author is trying to address objections, right? And so objections that we see starting to be raised already in the Synoptics, right? What kind is this blasphemous to say that a human being has the authority to forgive sins? Right? Did God authorized John the Baptist and Jesus to do this? The Synoptic Gospels were satisfied with a miracle story, saying, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. You there, get up and walk, right? And everybody's amazed. That was not felt to be sufficient, as the debates continued, and so the Gospel of John is doing further work in this way. And so its message is to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believe we have life in His name. What is important to add to that is the effort to persuade the reader includes addressing objections that were circulating in the author's time.
When do you think the Gospel of John started to be composed and then put together at the end into the text we have now?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it depends what you mean by composed, right? If you mean when did this material start taking shape?
As in the earliest edition of it, and when was the final edition that put all the pieces together?
Yeah. I mean, I see no reason, despite the, the fact that I have an appreciation for John A.T. Robinson's book, which was given the provocative title, The Priority of John. His aim there, he is explicit that it's not to say that it is the first gospel, but that it is a first gospel. It reflects an expression that is not just the result of a long development in time that's building explicitly and distinctively on the other gospels. I think that what I would say is that we really don't know when any of these texts took the form in which we'd recognize them as what they are, right? We don't know when any of the source material may have been written. The Q document, if there was such a thing, doesn't mention sort of crucifixion, resurrection. Is that because the author's not interested? Is it because the author is writing somewhere further afield and the movement has spread to places where news of the crucifixion hasn't gotten there yet? Is it because this material starts to be compiled already during the public activity of Jesus? Any of those are possible. And the truth is that we tend, in order to seem like we're being, duly cautious, we tend to, go with a later date or a middle of the road date between the earliest conceivable and the latest conceivable. But the truth is that there's no, and Jonathan Bernier's work on the dating of the New Testament works is really great in making this point. There's nothing inherently more likely about sort of the median date, right, between the earliest possible and the latest possible. And so there's nothing to prevent the possibility that something like the Gospel of John's material is being drafted somewhere, within a couple to a few decades of the crucifixion. I'm more inclined to think that the material is circulating orally and is developing in that way, as most things did in the ancient world, and that the writing takes place somewhat later. But one example which I've explored in an article, the title of which is "Destroy This Temple," right? We have in Paul's letters what seem to be echoes of the traditions about Jesus saying about the temple as we find them in John, right? So he says, on the one hand, whoever destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. On the other hand, he says, we have a temple, we have a tabernacle not made of human hands, right, awaiting us. And we get hints of that, in Mark and in John. And before Mark or John is written, we have Paul echoing the tradition, but echoing the tradition with features that we'll get in Mark, but also in John. Right? And so I think that the attempt to pin down when do we get a written edition of these, I think it's important. I think it's ultimately going to be unanswerable, right? Unless we find a whole new type of evidence that we don't currently have. And I think that significant amounts of this material is taking shape and being developed into its distinctive forms already in Paul's time. Right? And so I'd say that some of the material is there and is developing along with the synoptic material in tandem. And so that we get, as we get later, and if the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke are both among the latest and competing for last place, Luke has the most emphatically human Jesus, right, who does everything through the power of the Spirit. The Gospel of John assumes Jesus' humanity, but has this emphasis on him as the Word become flesh. And both of these things are there simultaneously. And so one thing that I don't think allows us to answer this question is the effort to say, well, this Christology is more developed, therefore it's later. Some people are saying some very exalted things, often without meaning what sort of apologists tend to assume they did. And on the other hand, there are those emphasizing the humanity of Jesus and his dependence on divine power that is not inherent in himself. Much later, as late in the process as we can go in the New Testament.
How does John's gospel portray Jesus differently on the theological category from the synoptics?
In terms of its theology, right, if we're using that in the strict sense, then it still affirms that there is one God. In terms of how the human Messiah relates to that one God, the one God is still the only true God in the Gospel of John. That the one God has these personified divine attributes, Word, Wisdom, Spirit, was something that early Christians probably largely agreed on, and that one encounters that in Jesus is also there, right? Paul is talking about Christ, the wisdom of God. And that wisdom tradition, right, what the prologue of the Gospel of John says about the Word, is just a variant of using a different term, a different personified divine attribute, but talking of the same type of concept. And so I am rather rare among scholars in saying that John is not that different. But speaking about theology in the strict sense, it's not theologically different, right? It's somewhat different in its Christology, but not, I would say, right, and this was at the heart of my research, going back to the earliest days, it's not different on, for instance, the question of monotheism, right? It's not more Trinitarian, let's say, or Binitarian Paul was, let's say, or than Matthew was.
What do you make of the beloved disciple?
Here too, I'm torn. On the one hand, I think it's plausible that there's a source, and it seems like if you want to highlight a source as authority, as later pseudepigraphal works did, then you name that source, right? That's why we have the saying, the hidden teaching of Jesus, which which Judas Thomas wrote down. We have works attributed explicitly to others. We don't get that in John, right? And that's interesting. On the other hand, the beloved disciple seems to be inserted where there isn't room for a male disciple to be, right? And so all the male disciples in the Synoptics flee, right? Peter maybe doesn't flee quite as far and follows along, like looking from a distance to see if he can see what's happening to Jesus. But yeah, as far as we know, they flee. One possibility that's intriguing is that the author, or better, the source, right, behind this, is none other than Lazarus of Bethany. Right? One thing I didn't mention is that the final chapter seems to provide clear evidence of editing. Right, it's a second ending where one wasn't really needed, and it seems to be addressing the death of the beloved disciple. Which, again, you don't need to address that if this is a literary construct, right? The last chapter seems to be indicating that this figure has died and that people had believed that this figure would live until Jesus returned. And it refers to that figure as, it says, he is the one who testifies of these things and wrote them down. And by that, I assume it means he had them written. But it may be that there's source material that makes it into the gospel that was written by this figure. So why possibly Lazarus? Well, we get the story of Lazarus, right, in John 11. And it's only after that we get to reference to the disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, right? And in the story of Lazarus, right, his sister sends word to Jesus and says, Lord, the one whom you love is ill, right? And so it would make perfect sense for this to be a way of, a way of the person who is editing this material, most likely, saying that, that's the figure who's behind this gospel, right? And so emphasizing his status as Jesus' friend, right? And that would make a lot of sense, right? It's clearly not the beloved disciple himself, whoever that was, presenting himself in this way, because it just seems unlikely, right? So that it could be Lazarus is, I think, an intriguing and quite plausible option for the two reasons that, on the one hand, we can see how a figure who had been been raised from the dead by Jesus might be thought, therefore he's not going to die again, right, until the end. And on the other hand, somebody from Bethany, right, who is local to the Jerusalem area, might have been present when Jesus, core of male followers from Galilee fled, right? The 12 fled and others, right? And so I think that's a possibility worth exploring. Like so many other things, it's not something we could prove, but if we go only by internal evidence, then that's probably the name we would attribute to the disciple whom Jesus loved.
So who do you think is more likely the beloved disciple if you lean towards any particular identification?
Yeah, I mean, Lazarus, I think, would be a better candidate than John the son of Zebedee, right? Who we assume fled with the other male disciples according to the Synoptics, and so really doesn't fit in those important ways. And then it may be being called the Gospel according to John, because the final author rather than the source is the one that is it's attributed to, right? And so we have reference to a John the Elder, right? And so we get this from Polycarp, who mentions that John the Elder, and I think we have the Papias tradition as well there. I'm trying to remember the details of that. And Michael Koch has done some really interesting stuff on that question. But so too has Martin Hengel, right? And the possibility that John the Elder, right, this figure that was a leader in the post-apostolic generation, was the editor of this, right? And therefore also perhaps the elder that is the author of the Johannine epistles, and that the style that we get is the style of this author / editor who is taking whatever source material fell into his hands and producing the final version of this. That seems quite possible. And so I think that Lazarus, if any name could be put on the source behind it, then it would be Lazarus, but that's still quite uncertain. And if any name is going to be given to the editor of this work, then why not John?
What caused the early church fathers and others to conclude that John, the son of Zebedee, was the beloved disciple?
Yeah, so we get this effort to attribute things to apostolic sources, right? And it's precisely that makes at least some of us open to the possibility that we have actual authentic recollection about the names of these individuals, right? So there's no reason to attribute something to Mark, right? Mark is not an authority figure in the early church, as far as we can tell. And in fact, there was effort later to say, well, Mark was Peter's interpreter, and so really you're hearing from Peter here. If the attribution was completely fabricated, we'd expect it to be attributed to Peter. Right? Luke, another example. And so I think that in this case, they had a John that was an apostolic figure that they could attribute it to. And so when this work that was known to be, according to John, circulated, some people either thought it would be in the best interest of the acceptance of this work and its authority, or simply made the assumption, right, reading, or hearing this is the gospel according to John, may have just made the assumption, oh, it must be John the Apostle, right? And so the combination of possibility of assumption and of deliberate transfer in order to enhance the authority, either of those makes sense.
Do you think that the attempt to create the beloved disciple, well, actually, let me rephrase that question. Do you think that the Gospel of John could have made up the beloved disciple, or do you think the beloved disciple was understood as conceptually as being a real person before the Gospel of John was composed?
Yeah, and as I at least touched on a little bit earlier, both are possibilities, and I'm open to both. I can see the arguments for both. On the one hand, the other Gospels don't seem to leave room for a male disciple at the cross, right? They all seem to have fled. On the other hand, the final chapter seems to be dealing with reactions to the death of this individual. And it's hard to see how a literary construct would allow us to make sense of the ending, right? That final chapter, that epilogue of the Gospel of John, in which the author is talking to the audience and saying, look, Jesus didn't say, this disciple will not die before he returns. He said, if I want him to live until my return, what is that to you? Right? And so we seem to be getting here some traditional material, some tradition that had been circulating, coupled with the author trying to do some damage control because it seemed that Jesus had been mistaken about this, right? And so that points to there being some actual figure, right? Because if there's no figure whose death caused this concern, then it's not clear what's being addressed in that chapter. There's really no reason for anyone to create material of that sort other than real life events necessitating it.
Do you think that the author of John's Gospel or authors are deliberately trying to create confusion and ambiguity about the identity of the beloved disciple? And do you think that potentially a complication in the idea that he's Lazarus or any the same person as anybody else in the Gospels is because he's not explicitly identified with anybody.
Yeah, when you don't have something explicit, unless you think that the fact that the sister of Lazarus says, "Lord, the one whom you love is ill," and then from that point on we get reference to the disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Unless you take that as explicit within the gospel, you're right. I mean, that's the wording that's there, but is it possible it's referring to someone else? Sure. Is there a deliberate effort to obscure the identity? I mean, it's hard to know why a later editor would do that. It's unclear whether the language of the disciple whom Jesus loved, right? It's unlikely that somebody would call himself that, right? Frankly, right? It seems much more like the kind of thing that somebody would say who admired that individual and who held that person in high esteem as an authority within the movement or within the community or something like that. So yeah, it's hard to say, but it seems to me that the gospel authors, the final producers of this gospel, let's put it that way, want to elevate this figure, right? And so they're highlighting, instead of just naming him, right, they're emphasizing his status as one who was a friend of Jesus, so that at the end, right, when this material is edited and the work is finally published in its final form, can say that, and gonna clue you in now, right? That person, right, who was so close to Jesus is the one who, is the source behind this. Right? The fact that we get sort of Lazarus as a name sort of reappearing, at the end, it's hard to say whether that tells against it, right? I mean, us as authors, even today, when people can go back and reread easily, right, a typeset manuscript and do things, we still, we'll watch a movie, based on a written screenplay, or we'll read a novel or a series of novels and be like, wait, but didn't they say earlier that this character, right? Didn't they? It's so hard, even today with today's technology and the ease of writing and of reading, to be completely consistent across things. We can only keep so much in our memories. And so that there'd be some inconsistency in the way this figure is referred to within the gospel, I don't think would work as a counter argument. So all I can say is that, like so many things about ancient history, it's an intriguing possibility. It's plausible, and it's very hard to say that it's strongly likely. It's certainly not, as far as I can see, in any way very unlikely. And that might be the best we can say.
And then my final question, when you look at the Gospel of John as a whole, what are the problems with the idea that, okay, John knows Mark, Matthew, and Luke, therefore let's just dismiss everything that's in John. Later texts can't possibly contain early material. What are the problems with that kind of viewpoint?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, right, the idea that the storytelling about Jesus, that's happening verbally just sort of vanishes because people write things down is not, is not conceivable, right? I mean, if you look at the way news circulates today, the fact that somebody, publishes an article or tweets something doesn't mean that, the wider media ecosphere, vanishes and, nothing is circulating independently of that, right? And sometimes the fact that somebody has put something out there does nothing to quell the counter narrative that's being woven somewhere else, right? And then that one will emerge, and although it may make it into your your information bubble relatively late, and you'll be like, where the heck did that come from? And then you find out that not only has that, what seems to you like a weird claim been circulating, but that people started circulating it like years earlier, right? And but it's only reaching you now, right? And so even though the way we communicate today is very different, there are things we can learn from it that will help us get away from this notion that just because someone writes something, that means that that's the definitive story and nobody else is saying anything different. And so I think that some key examples are the timing of Jesus' action in the temple, right? So why date it early, right? Could there be some symbolism there? Sure. But Mark only narrates one visit of Jesus to Jerusalem. And so if Mark wanted to include this event and thought it was important, Mark had no place else to put it, right? And so we have an explanation for why Mark might put it there. While Mark is followed by Matthew on this, is trying to do some damage control, right? It comes up at the hearing of Jesus. He said he'll destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And Mark tries to say, two witnesses stood up, which is the legal requirement. And they said this, and he says, yet even so, their testimony didn't agree. Well, how did it not agree if there's two of them and they're saying this thing, right? And so Mark is really trying hard to do some damage control here. John just places the statement on the lips of Jesus, but rewords it slightly, right? So it says, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And then it says, and this is quite telling, that later the disciples understood he was talking about his body. Right? And so this is a prediction of the resurrection. It has nothing to do with the temple he was standing in. What the author is also telling us is anyone who was standing there understood him to be talking about the temple. He's standing in the temple. He's talking about this building. And this is a threat against the temple. And according to John's timing, this is happening before John the Baptist is put in prison, right? So from a historian's perspective, that this might have been an action that Jesus undertook while part of John the Baptist's movement, is an intriguing possibility. And I explore then some of what I've written about John the Baptist. So I think that, there's, between the chronology, the fact that even when things are told in the author's distinctive style, they often reflect accurate, geographic knowledge and, other things, settings and things like that. There's good reason to think that this gospel contains historical material, maybe historical material that is filled with narratives, and things attributed to the characters that are in the author's distinctive style, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be something that's substance of it. So, that is in the substance of it that goes back. So all that to say that simply ignoring John should not be considered a viable option if one is interested in the historical Jesus, and I would add the historical John the Baptist too.
I just want to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase John's Apologetic Christology will be provided in the description below and in the pinned comment just below that. That being said, James, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for the chance to talk about this. This is a topic that I've been interested in, for decades, and so great to have a chat about it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.